All right, I want to look at some of the techniques used for street art. And the background of street art then is the definition of street art. It's a form of artwork that's displayed in public, on buildings, on streets, on trains, and publicly viewed surfaces. And a lot of them come in the form of guerrilla art, and that's sort of a different lesson. And guerrilla art's more conceptual. But the idea is that it's intended to make a personal statement about the society that the artist lives within. So it's moved from the beginnings of graffiti and vandalism into direction where the artist is working to bring messages or just even to beautify like the ugly sort of concrete city space to the audience, right? So it can be like a deep social, political sort of message, or it can just be to sort of change the way that we see the environment around us. So the main concept about street art is talking about public space, and street art is, they may refer to it sort of as smart vandalism, because it's a way to raise awareness of different issues using urban space as an opportunity to display personal artwork. The message doesn't necessarily reach a bigger audience sort of in an art gallery. That's sort of the issue, right? So public space is really important to reach sort of the masses, the everyday people, right? Not just necessarily the elite that or educated that may stereotypically attend like an art gallery. There's different challenges of risks, absolutely, associated with doing illegal work in public spaces. So some of the artists that we're going to be looking at, I mean, they've been arrested lots of times. There's risks that come with it, same with, actual graffiti. But the motive is to create art that reaches everyone, right? A broader audience. So, I mean, this all started sort of with Keith Haring, who was from New York City, and he started to do these drawings in the New York subways, and they were chalk outlines of figures and dogs and other images on blank black advertising space backgrounds. And he then was recognized and ended up creating larger scale works and colorful museum murals, and a lot of them were commissioned. But his themes were addressing sort of political and social themes. So he was focused on homosexuality and AIDS. And so again, you can see that his images are very sort of look a lot like advertisements in a way, and he's using that idea to sort of promote different ideas to the general public. Also, in Manhattan was JeanMichel Basquiat, and he was part of Samo, was an informal sort of graffiti duo, and he was very influenced by rap and punk and street art. And in the 1970s, all came together in the early sort of hip hop sort of music culture. And he used social commentary in his paintings that he did to talk about his experiences in the Black community at his time, and address ideas of power structures and systems of racism. Of course, a lot of people know Banksy's work, and he's an artist from London, and I haven't focused a whole lot on him just because I think there's so much that has already been talked about Banksy. And the problem is that they use graffiti and street art interchangeably with Banksy, and he primarily works on stencils. So again, there's two ways. He can actually cut out these stencils at home and then put up these large scale stencils at night and spray them, and that's one way that he can do his work. He works primarily in images of people. But the idea of a stencil is that you can make one stencil and it's reusable. So it's one way to get your image up over and over again relatively quickly. Another way that you could do is actually spray paint on a paper safely in your studio and then glue it up later on. So the problem is that Banksy is not a graffiti artist, and if you search like graffiti artist, one of the first names that will come up is Banksy, and in no way is he a graffiti artist, because graffiti has to have words in it, and street art is not anything to do with graffiti. They sort of coexist. A lot of murals can also be pieces of street art. So here's an example of local Toronto artist Poseur with Lovebot, and Lovebot is like a robot talking about, he makes these concrete robot-looking images with this like sort of mechanical heart, and talking about sort of bringing love, to the world through his messages. Wheat paste posters is something that Shepard Fairey uses quite a bit. So he pre-prints all these posters. Either he hand prints them or you can get them, commercially printed. And wheat paste is just a mixture of like flour and water, and really easy to use. And it's like super glue, and it's super easy for you to set your posters up and then put it over top, and it dries clear, and it's impossible to take off. And this is a method that people use to advertise. They've been using them for years, like to advertise for stores or to advertise for upcoming shows and bands and events, and they get plastered anywhere. So they're taking the advertising sort of tool that people use in cities, to post their stuff on walls and poles and things like that. So as a street artist, you can make these posters yourself and then mass produce them and put them up. You could spray paint stencil stuff on paper like an artist Swoon does or like Banksy does, and then put them up. There's also billboard bombing, and that's taking billboards and either putting different, juxtaposing them with different text to sort of change the meaning, or just putting your whole thing over top of the billboard, and just having a different sort of message. Stickers are huge in street art, and here's an example of Toronto sticker artist Urban Ninja. Or there's another one in the middle here, which is Zombie Art Squad. That's Port Perry artist who's come to visit us with his idea about zombies and making social political messages with that. There's another artist, his name is Denial, and I see his stuff everywhere. But they're again, you can either make them yourselves, or you can print them yourselves, or you can get them mass produced, but they're pretty small, and you can just put them up all over as sort of mini messages, promoting sort of your ideas, right? And typically they're on poles, on the backs of street signs, but it's the idea of just creating them and putting them up everywhere and getting your idea across. Street artists can also use installations, and on the image on the left is Christo, who actually passed away a week ago, believe it or not. And what he does things where he wraps buildings or changes the landscape by wrapping them, and that idea of covering things up. This is the last remnants of the Berlin Wall, and sort of making comments about that. Or again, street artists, you're just changing the perspective of the environment around people to get people to start to see things really differently. Here's another piece by Banksy where he actually in the middle of the night he's from London, England, and he stole like a British phone booth and then cut it up and changed it, and then and put it back on the streets. Street art sculpture is very powerful, and so we participated in the 88 Keys project, where it may not necessarily see as a sculpture, but the idea is that we took a piano and changed it and used it so we could have the community sort of interact with each other and with a piece of music in a different way. There's also in Oshawa, this is another one on Taunton Road that's like just, again, not necessarily sculpture, but the idea of taking, a bell box and painting it on it. Well, one, the whole purpose was to stop vandalism, but another purpose is just to change everyday old, ugly things around our city and just making them beautiful and source of bringing artwork, to the community. So something else which is really, really cool, and I think with a lot of the stuff going on right now, we've actually seen, I think in the UK they did this in the George Floyd protests even yesterday, where they projected Black Lives Matter onto one of their buildings. And this is really cool, where it's like this sculpture. This one's called the Dreaming House. So it's the idea that this building, what would a building dream about if it was having a dream? So again, none of this is actually really happening. This is all just a video projection onto the wall, which is just remarkable. So there's a really neat group called Graffiti Research Lab, and they're doing a lot of really neat stuff where they're taking the ideas of street art and graffiti and they're integrating it with technology, and they're creating these amazing works that can't necessarily be considered vandalism, because you're not permanently doing anything. You're just doing something that's temporary, and you're not actually altering the physical wall or the qualities of it, but you're just temporarily like projecting these things on it. They do some really neat stuff. So this one's just incredible, and I'll do a link. There's also audio that goes with it, so I'll put a link at the end, at the bottom of this, so you can actually maybe watch this video in full. But again, none of this actually exists. This is all just a projection. So speaking of Graffiti Research Lab, and I'll put a link to them as well, they do something really cool where this is called the laser tag, and a laser stands for something, but we actually built this in our classroom once, where you actually project onto a building or a surface, but you're using a laser light and projection screen and an infrared sensor to actually do graffiti-like stuff. So they wrote this program where they are using the laser pointer, and they can point it on the building and it sort of mimic the idea of graffiti. So, you're temporarily vandalizing buildings. And this one's really interesting because, they pull up in their RV and they've got everything set up and they're starting to project this. And then the police, have no idea where this is coming from, and they have to go and try and find them, but they could really easily pack up their RV and go somewhere else. And what's really neat about Graffiti Research Lab is they have tons of different stuff that they do. And all this stuff is downloadable, and you can change it. So we actually downloaded the program. They have different types of fonts that you can play with, and they want people to play around with it and do more and more with it. So they do some really neat stuff. But again, it's pushing the boundaries of what graffiti is and free speech. Is this vandalism? No, it's not, because it's temporary. But how can you control what's being said, and how can you use public space? So they do some really neat stuff. So Graffiti Research Lab, I'll put a link there for you, but they do this really neat stuff with LED lights. So we actually did this project before. We had LED lights and we had magnets on them, and the one with the car, they actually throw them on things. You can organize them a certain way to look a certain way. Mosaic tiling is another form of street art. So this is an artist. His name is Space Invader. So he's using public space and sort of to invade it, and he does these little sort of Atari-like video game characters in mosaic tiles, and he posts them up everywhere, and it's kind of cool because they're like subway tiles in a lot of ways, where the subways sort of use mosaics to like line their subways. But so he's using a variety of sort of urban techniques and comments on the popular culture of the time of video games, and puts up these little messages. So again, street art can send a message that's social, political, environmental, but also sometimes it's just to change the way that we view things. So yarn bombing is something where you're knitting or crocheting things out of yarn, and you wrapping them. So again, it's similar to what Christo does, where you're changing people's perspective about by wrapping stuff. But having this blanket put over top of a tank makes it like a tank cozy, and again, but it just changes. It does make comments sometimes. Sometimes it just changes the way that we sort of view things, and it looks out of place, and it's bright and colorful like graffiti in a dull place. But those are just some of the techniques for promoting street art, and there's lots more, but that's just sort of to give you background about some of the tools and techniques that some artists are using to sort of promote different ideas in the streets.